Welcome to chapter 13. We're getting close to the end of this book. This particular chapter, Freeform and Avant-Garde, I think it's the most difficult to wrap your head around. At least it is for me. So go through here and take a quick look. We've tried to capture some qualities of Avant-Garde here to help you to have something to identify it with. And this may be more useful for you here. We've updated the playlist. Your required listening is right here, and additional listening is right here. And we'll begin with this quote: "But is it jazz?" And I think the more we listen, the more you'll understand that question, whatever it may be. And one often has the feeling that even the musicians don't quite know what they have hold of. It is a music in flux, if anything. It must not be burdened with comparisons that are unwarranted. This is a quote by Dan Morgenstern, who I think has tapped into something about how to view this, which is not from any lens you're familiar with. Okay, freeform, avant-garde, where you can use those terms interchangeably. As the eras and styles of jazz have developed, either one style grows out of an existing style or one style grows in reaction to an existing style. That's what we've seen so far as we've studied the various periods of jazz, the various styles. And as whatever that jazz has been, whether it's been cool or bop or swing or what have you, funky, many elements have been shared across those styles. Harmonic structures, chord progressions, rhythmic structures, predictable forms such as AABA, or the unison themes with the improvising solos in the middle, returning to the unison themes again. Freeform doesn't seem to grow out of anything. It's a lot like Jackson Pollock's non-representational painting, where he just splatters things and displayed them, and people look at it and they go, it looks like he just splattered something, Free jazz is kind of like that. It hits people the same way. It doesn't hinge on anything that you recognize. It's not built on standard melodies. They've thrown away standard form. If they're using harmonic structures, they're certainly not the usual ones that we are familiar with. Those driving rhythms, not necessarily there. In fact, it's more like a process. It's more like you're in on a process. It's a conversation amongst players that has some discipline to it, but it's by and large non-structured. They've recommended that you listen to Lorraine by Red Mitchell, a bassist, Shelly Mann, a drummer, and Ornette Coleman, who's going to be somebody that's we've featured in this particular thing. We start with listening to the interactive dialogue number 9, and here's something to help you process that. Okay, let's see here. Some who had foreshadowed this move to free jazz, there's a guy named Joe Harriott who plays alto sax, who was called an abstractionist because he was moving in this freeform direction. We've talked about Lenny Tristano, a piano player who was experimenting as well. Charles Mingus, we just spoke about a couple chapters ago, the bassist. John Coltrane, he was in the previous chapter, the saxophone player who moved all the way from bop through cool and now hard bop and so forth, funky, into free form here. All of these had pushed hard on the musical fabric to give it freer expression. So in essence, freeform didn't just come out of nowhere. There were people that were experimenting with it, okay? There was a Charles Mingus piece called Pithecanthropus erectus, and that was on suggested listing earlier on an earlier chapter, and it's here again. So it might be something you want to pick off that additional listening list and check it off. Free jazz players came to it from different backgrounds and from different philosophies. Yet they all had their own distinctive stamp, and their music is very easily distinguished from one another's. The three guys we're going to take a hard look at are Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, and Cecil Taylor. Some hold the tenet that the seeds of free form have always existed, that it's been present since the beginning of jazz in every improvisation, even if it's only in the rhythm section's choice of their notes or their patterns. Free form falls on the improvisational side when you're looking at that balance between European composed music and African American spontaneous improvisation passed orally. In this form, it lines heavily with that African American tradition of spontaneous improvised on the spot. Free form is the very fullest expression of spontaneous composition. Okay, first person we look at is saxophonist Ornette Coleman. And there's several additional listings that they recommend: Lonely Woman, Congeniality, Free Jazz, and Song X. He had a controversial career. Critics either adored him or they thought he wasn't even worthy of their consideration. Some felt he'd turned to free form because he just wasn't very good and he wasn't capable of playing anything else on par with other jazz players. He didn't care what they thought. He was melody oriented. He just didn't play anything that you'd recognize as a previously written melody. He phrased freely, but it didn't necessarily fit into measures or over chord progressions like we've been used to. You'll remember that Lester Young was the first person who played out his ideas even if they didn't fit in the 8 bars. So we've seen a little foreshadowing of that before too. He didn't care if the music had a regular pulse. He didn't need it. He didn't need any kind of identifiable chord progressions. He didn't need a key center. In fact, he was entirely comfortable with atonality, but he didn't even need a home bass at all. He had complete harmonic freedom, and a lot of people called his intonation faulty, but it's only faulty if you use the European scale as the guide of what's in tune. He made up things. For example, he used this word harmolodic and called it harmolodic theory, something he invented which struck a new balance between melody and harmony. And we're going to listen to a piece of his called Faces and Places on Spotify with the listening guide. Next person we're going to look at is Cecil Taylor, a pianist. He comes to freeform with a completely different background than Ornette Coleman. Cecil Taylor was traditionally trained through a conservatory. He knew technique and he knew composition. There's some additional listening to do here: Inner Evening, Idut, Serdab, and Three Faces. His music had a third stream flavor. In fact, some people wonder if it's classical or is it jazz. He used fragmented punctuated statements. He used the piano oftentimes percussively, using cluster notes, like where you take your whole hand and just push a bunch of notes down at once. He used sequence of textures through energy levels, and he focused on a composite sound instead of individual players. His music requires a lot of intensity, and it requires stamina from the players and also from listeners. His concerts were very long. He played long, uninterrupted compositions. And again, here's a couple listening things you might want to check in with, even just briefly. Okay, we've stated all that. Let's see. There was a Chicago style of free jazz. In fact, a lot of avant-garde was happening in Chicago, and a person to come out of that was named Sun Ra, a pianist and composer who had sort of a mysterious childhood. He worked as a pianist and arranger for known bands like Jesse Miller in New York and Fletcher Henderson in New York way back in the 1950s. He played with a quartet in 1953 that became the big band orchestra. And that particular band is mostly what Sun Ra is known for. His work, too, was very controversial. Some saw him as a great innovator, and some saw him as a charlatan. And when he talked about music, it was kind of strange. He would say it was universal, and that's not unusual, but he'd say it's intergalactic, or hieroglyphic sound, or abstract analysis. He would say things like it was the synthesis of man's relationship to the universe, that it was both visible and invisible for first man and second man, that it moved from the past to uncharted multi-potential planes outside the bounds of limited earth eternity future. So he kind of spoke in chaotic, hard to follow language as well. So very mysterious guy. More concretely, he employed a collective improvisation in big band, which was an incredible feat. And in his music, a structure emerges from the communication amongst the players. And there's some listening to do with from him that's on the additional list, Heliocentric Worlds. You might want to check in with that. Looking at this next group, Association for Advancement of Creative Music, or AACM, founded by Richard Abrams, who was a composer, a pianist, and a clarinetist. They basically used an experimental band, and they shifted the personnel around to fit the projects. And there was lots of groups that's inspired by their work. One particular one was the Art Ensemble of Chicago. Had 4 players in it: Joseph Jarman, who came from rock and blues background and believed in multimedia formats. There was Roscoe Mitchell. He came from a bop background. Lester Bowie was their trumpeter, and he came from the experimental band. And Malachi Favors was their bassist. This group worked in Chicago for a while, but in 1969 they moved to Paris and made notable albums. And the trademarks are there. That creative interaction, variety of tone colors, exploring different sound structures, and suspending the rhythmic support, which basically means they played without a drummer. There was also a black artist group that was organized in much the same manner as AACM. And let's see if I can pull out their name, because I meant to type it and did not, but I'll do that before I post it. It was organized in much the same manner, and 3 of their players ended up becoming part of the World Saxophone Quartet. Moving on, let's see. Oh, that was called Inbase. Okay, and we're going to add that to the slide. I'm going to pause here for a second. This Art Ensemble of Chicago, something that was noted about them is that they worked from a compositional chart. It described how the performer was supposed to proceed and how much time they spent doing this or that. Okay, moving to the next slide. Let's see here. We're going to look at this multifaceted woodwind player named Anthony Braxton. He wrote compositions based on well-crafted notions about timbre and time relationships developed freely, being improvised. And he made this album called Anthony Braxton, New York, Fall of '74, where every cut on the album is based on a geometric design. Let's see. And looking at contemporary avant-garde, we look at Greg Osby, the saxophonist, who thinks if you look back at previous styles that you've lost the spirit of jazz. By definition, avant-garde means to stand against the status quo, and so that means in jazz that you have to find your individual voice. Also looking at Henry Threadgill, a composer who feels that neoclassicism involves retro, which is anti-evolutionary, which means that jazz isn't going forward, it isn't evolving anywhere. He states that that neoclassicism is destructive, that avant-garde can embrace the context of jazz but not the previous content that it works with. He works with an ensemble named Very Very Circus, which pushes jazz front edge by asserting individualism and relying on global music influences. There is a free jazz controversy. And today's players make no connection with past musical styles. They play simply emotion. They express feelings not previously reflected. And it could be hate music, it could be love music, it could be something else. It's very chaotic music. It has found an audience, but not a large audience. Free form thrives on controversy, breaking all the barriers, breaking all the rules. And there's a lot of questions around it. Is it jazz? Is it even music? It doesn't have a large following. Does it have the right to exist and the right to fail? It doesn't have any swing. It doesn't have formal organization. The rhythm section isn't normal. The melodic instruments don't follow typical patterns. They don't use solo versus ensemble or strict time. This stuff possesses only sound and feeling. It is a music in flux, and perhaps comparisons to whatever came before are unfair and maybe even pointless. And again, that's the statement of Dan Morgenstein. Enjoy the listening and try to wrap your head around it. This is quite a chapter in jazz's history.